Good evening, everyone. Hello. Welcome back for another series of the Arboricultural Association's Wednesday webinars. My name is John Parker. I'm still somehow Chief Executive Officer at the association, and I'm here in Stonehouse in Gloucestershire. And I'm very honoured to once again be your host for this evening. And first of all, I'm contractually obliged to say that I'd like to say thank you to our friends at Steel who have sponsored the webinars. Thank you. Yay! Please use the chat to say hello. Let us know where you're watching from. Select everyone as the correct option. Don't just send it to me and Jim. Use the Q&A button to submit any questions you might have, and we'll work through as many as we can at the end. If you tick the box to receive CEUs when you registered, then that will be sorted out for you, so please don't pester us to ask. And yes, we'll provide a certificate if you ask for one. Also, yes, the webinar will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel at some point in the near future. This evening, as I'm sure you'll know, we're joined by Jim Mullholland, who will be speaking to us about British bats. But before then, as we haven't seen each other for a while, I thought I'd take the opportunity to give you a couple of updates. First of all, this is my dog. I thought I'd introduce him at some point later, but he wants to sit on me. So this is Nye. Hello, world. But first of all, even more importantly, I'd like to acknowledge all of my amazing team here at the association and all of our fabulous volunteers, whether they're helping with branches or as ARB ambassadors or as trustees. We couldn't do what we do without you all, so thank you. And on the subject of trustees, if you haven't heard already, we've had a change in chair at the association with Neil Davis taking on the role. And a big thank you from all of us is due to the previous chair, Michelle Ryan, who did so much for the organisation. So thank you, Michelle, and welcome, Neil. As well as our staff team and volunteers, the main thing that really supports our work and of course gives us a reason to get out of bed in the morning is our members. So thank you to all of you out there who are a member of the association. And if you're not a member, please do consider joining. I know that you get the webinars for free, whether you're a member or not, but there's all sorts of other benefits to membership. And ultimately, what we get from that is subscriptions, and that funds all of our activities, including the webinars that you're about to enjoy. We've been very organised this year. We've sorted out pretty much the whole series in advance, so I can tell you we'll be having a webinar every week other than Christmas Day and New Year's Day, and they'll be running until the end of February. We've got some really good stuff coming up. Yes, we have, Nye, really good stuff. Not least of all, the next two webinars, both from speakers you may well have heard of before, but who always have something new and interesting to say. Next week, we've got Ted Green giving a non-ARBS view on tree myths and fairy tales. And then the following week, on November the 13th, it's Jeremy Barrell who will be speaking about practical tree wisdom. And you can register for both of those webinars and some of the other webinars we've got coming up on our website right now. So, without further ado, I'm delighted to be able to hand over to the main event, Jim Mullholland. Jim, it is over to you.
Thank you very much, John. Good evening, everyone. I'm blown away by how many people want to come and listen and hear a bit about bats. And what better way to prepare for Halloween, right? A big thank you to Naomi, first of all. The felt bat eventually made its way to me. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to find a place for it on my shiny shelf behind me. And John will be glad to hear, I'm sure many watchers will be glad to hear that ketchup is in stock and chips are on their way. So without delaying any more, should we get on with it? Let's do it. So let me just launch my presentation. Hopefully you can see that. You'll have to jump in and shout if you can't see it. I'm going to do a little bit of Q&A to kind of get us started. So as you've already been doing so in the chats, I'd love if you could type some answers in. I'm going to kind of throw some questions out there, and I'd love to kind of just kind of test the water to see what people know already. So we're going to be talking about our great British bats. But to start off, I'm interested to know if people know how many species of bats we have in the UK. Look at this, people even jumping the gun. They knew what the question I was going to ask. 17 straight off the bat before I even asked the question. Lee, 17, 18, yeah, it kind of depends on which authority you believe. But we had a species of bat that went extinct in 1994, and it was found again more recently than that, and it's kind of hanging around. And there's a bit of a question about whether it breeds or not, so hence 17 or 18 bats. Yes, indeed. How many species of bats in the whole world then? 120. We've got some very precise answers, 1,472, 1,450. It's about 1,500, and the numbers keep climbing gradually. Yeah, so huge diversity of species. And both in the UK and around the world, they comprise about a quarter of all of our mammal species. So a really significant group. But because they are, on the whole, nocturnal, or certainly the ones we have in the UK, our microbats are nocturnal, they are a group that's really quite challenging to study. If you think about the Victorians and their interest in birds, studying birds is kind of relatively straightforward. You could do it with minimal equipment. If you've got some optics, great. But when it comes to bats, you need bat detectors, you need night vision equipment, and that's relatively recent technology. And it's constantly improving as well, kind of helping us improve how we survey bats. So bats are like us. They're mammals. They are furry, hairy, and they give birth to live young, typically one a year. And let's have a bit of a look at what we're talking about here then. So this is what we're talking about, a wonderful clip from David Attenborough's Life of Mammals on the BBC. So we can see this brown, long-eared bat coming into shot and just hovering, no prizes for where it gets its name from. And the group that bats are in is known as Chiroptera. And Cairo means hands, and ptera as in pterodactyl, wings. So the name kind of essentially means hand wings. So the way they fly is very different to birds, for example. They have a forearm and feathers coming off of that. So you can see in the photo here, the forearm and the thumb sticking out the top of the wing. And then it's essentially the finger bones and the palm bones that hold open a wing membrane, which is only a few cells thick, that allow bats to fly. I've mentioned already that bats are nocturnal. So how then do they find their way around in the dark? Give me some suggestions of how they find their way around in the dark, if you would be so kind in the chat. Are they? There we go. Fantastic. Echolocation. Absolutely. So this is a process by which they shout and emit a really high volume noise out into the environment. It hits things and it bounces back, and they're listening to the returning echoes to help them navigate, help them hone in on prey. And the sounds that they produce are all really high frequency. So by and large, they can't be heard by humans. When you're really young, our hearing's a little bit better. So kind of our top end of our hearing can just about hear the bottom end of bats. And when they are doing various social activities and they produce these vocalizations associated with that rather than echolocation, those are typically lower frequency as well. So you might be able to just about hear them as well. So what do these things sound like? So hopefully the sound is working. We had a bit of a technical issue first thing with the sound, but here's some echolocation calls recorded through a bat detector. Thank you, Nancy, for confirming that it works. Lovely. And here we have a nocturnal bat, and you might be able to hear that chip chop, chip chop, chip chop that it's producing as it flies in really open landscapes. So these essentially are the swafts and the swallows of the nighttime. As the swafts and swallows and the martins go to bed, the nocturals come out and fly at high speeds in really open environments. Who else do we have lurking in the darkness then? We had a chip chopping previously, and now we have a kind of a drier clicking sound. When I first started studying bats, there was a description in a book that talked about some of these species, and this is a group of species that produce very similar calls called the myotis. Some of their calls sound like burning stubble. And I'm too young to remember what that meant, but I thought it meant the stubble on your face. And I thought that was really weird. Like, what are people doing to burn the stubble on their face? What it actually means, it's the kind of remnants of an arable crop, and it was harvested and the base of it was left. And there was a practice where that used to be burnt off. So it was that noise that they were referring to. You might remember that if you're slightly older. If you're young like me, you probably don't. What have we got here then? Some of our most common species of bats. These are our pipistrelle bats. And we have a kind of wet, slappy sound. We had a dry, clicky sound previously, but here we've got a wet, slappy sound with a few social calls mixed in there, that rap, rap, rap that was coming. And this is the point at which, when I do a talk in person, I encourage everyone to behave like a pipistrelle. I'm not going to have to do this on faith because I can't see what you're doing But what you need to do is you're going to grab your cheeks like this, and we're going to produce a wet, slappy sound. I've got no idea if this is going to come through the microphone, but I'm trusting you're doing this here. Ready? Going to do it with me. You slap it back and forth against your teeth. I have no idea if that came across, but hopefully it sounds a bit like the wet, slappy sound you can hear on the slide there. So our pipistrelle's flying off now, and the final bat we're going to hear from. We've got a spaceship coming into view. So this isn't the clangers. This is one of our horseshoe bats. Absolutely, indeed, yeah. Really weird bats, unlike any of our other bats in the UK. So they're kind of in a group on their own, and their roosting behaviour, their foraging, their echolocation, everything about them's a little bit weird. And we're going to see one of them close up a little bit later on. So you can see the horseshoe flying off now. Great stuff. So we've heard about how they navigate in the dark and the sounds that are being emitted that were all around us if you go to the countryside, but we just can't hear them without the aid of a bat detector. So what then are bats feeding on? We've got a grey long-eared bat here that's caught some prey to chomp on. What types of things in the UK I'm thinking about here? What types of things do bats feed on? So we've got moths, insects. Yeah, I can see some mention of some other things like frogs, and what have you. What else have we got? Yeah, frogs, mozzies, spiders. Yeah, so frogs, we don't tend to have many of those in the UK unless you go to a zoo. We've got nectar mentioned as well. Again, kind of bats from elsewhere in the world. Fish, absolutely. We've got one species that is reported in the literature to take fish. That's the Benton's bats. But by and large, what they eat are insects and other invertebrates. So we're talking about things like beetles, wasps, bees, caddisfly, lacewings, moths, even things like biting midges. And I was out yesterday in Pembrokeshire and still getting bitten by midges at this time of year because it's quite a mild time. So those are probably things that make sense, right? And then we've got some other things like grasshoppers, earwigs, bugs, and spiders. And perhaps even weirder things like caterpillars and millipedes. And you might be thinking, well, how the hell do they catch them? So how do bats catch their prey then? What options do they have for catching their prey? What have we got here? We've got gleaning mentioned in the chat. A .22 rifle. I'm not sure they've got the squeeze action needed to fire a rifle with that kind of precision. I'm not sure they've got the discipline. We've got hawking, chase and capture, scooping off water surface. Yeah, lots of different ways essentially. So the most typical way, I'm sure you think of, and I mentioned it earlier on, is that they are on the wing and their prey is on the wing. So we have a beetle that comes along a bit like this, and then a bat, this is a nocturnal bat, swooping in after it and catching it like that. And so here we have the prey on the wing, we have the bat on the wing, and we call this hawking, so aerial hawking. We have some bats that are lazy. So I mentioned about the horseshoe bats. They're not going to waste energy where they don't need to. So they find an area where there's likely to be a good amount of food. They fly on in and they hang up on a tree. And then they kind of just wait. Why go after the food when the food can come to you? So where you get cows, you get lots of cow poo. Where you get lots of cow poo, you get lots of dung beetles and flies that are interested in that. So they come on in and the bat thinks, thank you very much. Yeah, swoop on out, grab the bait, and then fly back in and hang up and wait for the next prey item to come along, saving energy rather than flying around constantly. And we call this perch hunting. I've got an illustration showing this. I work with a fantastic artist called Ed, and he's helped capture some of the kind of or less well documented aspects of bats ecology and put them into graphics for me. So you might notice I've also have on a light box behind me as well in my office, which is very, very nice. So we can see the dung beetle here, the dung flies associated with the cowpats. And if we move along the scene, we can see the horseshoe bat hanging up in the tree, waiting for its prey to come to it. We heard about bats catching insects over water. So when we have water, there's lots of insects that will emerge from that. And so we have some species specializing in taking them over water, such as Benton's bats and Brandt's bats in the UK. So it seems a bit one-sided, doesn't it? That bats fly around, they've got this excellent way of navigating in the dark, and they can pick up whatever prey they want. Well, of course, we know that evolution doesn't stand still like that. So we see evolved in certain species a kind of an ear that allows them to detect bats. So our noctuid moths, our tiger beetles, green lacewings, and dung beetles, they can essentially hear the echolocation calls, and as a bat comes by, they just drop out of the sky, evading capture in doing so, or hopefully evading capture in doing so. There's other things they can do as well. So there's some fantastic researchers from Bristol University that looked at camouflage on moth wings. So this is a kind of a theoretical model of a moth wing with lots of different scales, and you can see the different shapes and sizes illustrated there. And essentially these are like the leaves and the fine branches on a tree that when you see the big wind blow through, the leaves move around, the fine branches move, and the bigger branches just sway gently. By the time you get to the main scaffold and the stem, there's barely any movement at all. So these help dissipate the energy, and so you don't see as strong an echo coming back from them. And to test this, they fired sound at moth wings and at some butterfly wings as well. So you can see the visual representation on the left-hand side there, but also the reflected sound on the right-hand side. So you can see much less of a trace for the moth compared to the butterfly, because the butterfly doesn't need to evade bats because they're out during the day, of course. An alternative to camouflaging yourself is by tricking the bats. So if you're going to reflect sound, it's probably best if the very, very tip of your wing reflects the most sound, so that if a bat gets close enough and can swoop in, they focus on the wrong bit, because if they do swoop in, they might damage the tip of the wing, but hopefully the moth can fly away to live another day. Certain species have also been able to mimic or jam the echolocation system of bats. So we mentioned that there's a noise being emitted by the bats. It bounces off of the prey item and the bat's listening to the echoes. So there's some species of moth that can jam that noise by making their own ultrasonic noise. So the bat doesn't know what's the echo and what's the noise coming off the prey itself. And there's a fantastic YouTube video on this, interestingly, on QI last night. So they were talking about it as well. So if you're in the UK, this is Series V, Episode 2, Vocal, and they talked about the moth that were able to do this to distract the bat's echolocation system. So we see this arms race, that you see evolution of echolocation and the prey responding, and of course then the bats are going to respond again. So we see a wonderful array of fantastic ears in bats, like our long-eared bats here, but also other species like our Bechstein's bats, really big ears. And these are designed so that they can switch off their echolocation and forage just by listening. So they get close to where they need to be and they can just listen then. And there's a fantastic clip from Life of Mammals that shows a brown long-eared hovering in front of a moth on a leaf, and it waits for the moth to move before it swoops in and kind of hears that sound. Our Bechstein's bats here actually are able to forage on the ground. So if you think about leaf litter and the various things you find on the woodland floor, they fly along, get close, land on the floor, and then they can hear the various invertebrates and things scurrying around on the floor. They chase after them. Once they grab them, then they can take off from the floor. And we had gleaning mentioned in the chat earlier on as well. And so here we have a grey long-eared bat doing his best to track down the moth that's hidden under the leaf here. So hopefully you can see the moth tucked away down here. And this is the concept known as gleaning, so animals on vegetation itself. One of the things they talked on QI last night about was this idea of bats being blind, and they were very good in dismissing that complete fallacy that in actual fact, bats have fantastic eyesight. But of course, for a species that's nocturnal, a lot of the time it's not that useful. But we do see our species that hunt more either by just listening to sound or by gleaning have fantastically large eyes like this brown long-eared bat, just to help with that final approach when they're homing in on their prey. And another clip for you from Attenborough's Life of Mammals showing this gleaning in action. So this is a natterer's bat taking a spider out of a web. That's so good. I think we should watch that again. Right, let's go back again. Watch that again, shall we? One of the things we look at when we're trying to identify bats, and natterers is quite a cryptic species, we look at things like the shape of the tail membrane or whether there's bristles or hairs. And the bats that trawl have a straight tail membrane with long hairs for detecting insects as they pass by, whereas the natterer's bat has a curved tail membrane. And that essentially acts like a scoop for doing this, for taking spiders out of their webs. It also has some short bristles, quite thick bristles, which means that they don't then get stuck to the cobweb itself, because as you know, cobwebs are very sticky material, so you don't want to end up with a bat in the cobweb. When we look at our different bat species, we can tell a lot about the species itself and its ecology by looking at the wings of the bat. So we've got a few different species here. So at the top left, we have Nethusius pipistrelle, quite a relatively short but broad wing. We've got a brown long-eared bat on the top right there. And again, quite a broad wing, but more of the broadness coming from the finger bones rather than between the fifth finger, which is this one here, and the body. So the kind of more broad over here than over here, as the Nethusius pipistrelle was slightly broader there. If we look at the bottom two, then here are two of our larger bats. So bottom left is serotine, bottom right is noctule. So I've mentioned noctules already. They're the fighter pilots of the sky. They fly fast, but in straight lines. They've got a really big turning circle, and that's because they have a long, narrow wing. Our serotine bat is a much slower flyer, much more maneuverable, and that's because of the depth to its wing. So the length of that fifth finger that holds open the wing there. Let's dive into some of our species then. So I told you we'd see this one. These are the weird bats, the horseshoe bats. They're crazy. Very, very odd. The only redeeming feature they have is this wonderful warbling sound that they make. The reason why, there's several reasons why I disdain them so much. Worst of all British bats, the greater horseshoe here, not lesser. That does have some redeeming qualities. Apart from the sound, is that they're boring. They don't roost in trees. So you typically find them in caves. That's where they evolved. And nowadays we find them more often in buildings. So they're kind of interesting, I guess. And we have a lesser horseshoe here, the slightly cuter, slightly sweeter cousin of the greater horseshoe. The greater ones are a bit mean. They bite you, really big teeth. I've had greater horseshoes wee in my mouth and poo down my neck. So you can kind of hopefully forgive me for not liking them quite as much as other species of bats. So you can see the lesser horseshoes here flying around, and the structure of this building, a bit like an open cave, isn't it? Where they would have evolved. And then when they're ready to leave, they really hug the building and then tuck and fly down into the next opening and then fly around in that section as well, before eventually heading on out and again hugging the wall as they fly into the neighboring woodland. And we'll slow that down a little bit. So this is what it looks like when the bats are thinking about coming out. Really broad wing shapes that lets them turn on a dime like that and fly back into the building. We don't really understand why they do this. Perhaps it's warming up, perhaps it's to confuse predators, but eventually they make the decision that they're ready and they're going to head on out and try their chances feeding in the night sky. That's enough about horseshoe bats. Let's talk about the cool bats. That's what we're all here for, right? Hopefully this is a lovely community of tree people. We're going to get onto the cool bats now. This is not number one, it's number two, I think. Number two, it's up there, it's good. This is our barber-style bat, and very much a tree specialist. And when we look at our tree roosting species, we can broadly split them out into whether they like crevices. So this is a barber-style roost here and a transverse snap. So you can see that long split running through the stem of the tree. We also see them quite frequently under lifting bark in hazard beam cracks where a curved branch has been straightened. So they really like to tuck themselves away. So they've got back and belly contact and they can reverse into a feature, giving them lots and lots of protection. One of our other tree specialists, the Bechstein's bat, prefers the opposite, prefers a bit more space. And they're a species that evolved alongside woodpeckers. So woodpeckers create a wonderful nesting cavity, and the Bechstein's bats will take advantage of that. They can be in, to the side, below, or in this case, roosting above if the decay pocket is extended up above the entrance. and they like a bit more space around them. And Bechsteins try to camouflage themselves against the kind of inner side of the trunk. So on the decaying wood, they hang upside down on the kind of the sides of it. So hopefully they can avoid detection. Lovely. So that's a bit about how or where bats roost. So let's get into the bat year. I always struggle to think about where we start with the bat year. So I'm gone with where we are now. So in the chat, if you'd be so kind, what are bats up to at this time of year, do you think? Got mating, resting up, heading into hibernation, sleeping, being spooky, knuckling down, snacking lots. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we're in that kind of transition, and it very much depends on the prevailing conditions. And in the UK, our winters are getting much milder and much wetter. And so this end of the summer, heading into autumn, heading into winter, the period is kind of extended a lot more because they're not forced into hibernation straight away if there's food still around. As I mentioned, I was out in Pembrokeshire, West Wales yesterday, and I was getting bitten by midges. So there's still plenty of bat food around if they end up in the right places. So as we head from autumn into winter, then we are entering kind of true hibernation. And so what is it then? What is it that causes bats to hibernate? What's the change we see from summer heading into winter that forces bats into hibernation? Temperature, yeah, cold, less food, lack of food, absolutely. If you think about the insects, they're kind of reducing in number. So if your food is reducing in number, your activity also needs to reduce as well. So we see this kind of transition into hibernation. And hibernation isn't one big long sleep. They might be inactive for a period of maybe a couple of weeks at its maximum. Could be quite shorter than that if the conditions are right. If it's still warm and they can go out and feed, they will do. So they kind of go into extended periods of torpor, but it's not a complete shutdown. And so this is because they need to regulate things like immunity and their immune system so they don't get overcome by pathogens, things like that. They need to regulate their internal clock so that when they do wake up, it's nighttime and they can, at least have the opportunity to go out under the cover of darkness and feed or take on water if they need to. And it will very much be driven by the prevailing conditions. So if it's warm and the bats have an opportunity to feed, they're going to do it. And there's various studies showing the importance of, for example, winter grazing around horseshoe roosts, where you get the dung there in the winter, you get the insects associated with that, and then the bats can pop out from those hibernacula, get a bit of food, get a bit of water, and then pop back in for another nice long sleep. And of course, with our milder and wetter winters, you might think on one hand, well, perhaps the insects are hanging around for longer, but we also see changes in farming practices where you can't have stock out on the land as much because it's just a bit too wet and they would poach all the ground. So kind of seeing changes as the climate changes. And typically then, when we think about hibernations, we think about sites like this, underground, where there's lots of insulation. So here we have a disused railway tunnel. The beaching cuts in 1960 were fantastic for bats because you get rid of the railway line, nice quiet tunnel, and so many of these have been converted into great hibernation sites for bats. And you can see the conditions outside, snowy in this photo here, but this tunnel is about 600 meters long. And in the center of it, it doesn't fluctuate more than a degree above or below 7 degrees. So 6 to 8 degrees, basically right at the center. So nice and stable. And that kind of changes as you come towards the entrance. But bats also hibernate in trees. Some will hang out right until the last minute. So our Bechsteins and Barberstales will be in the woodlands until maybe late December. But come January and February, it's just a bit too cold, so that will force them underground. Whereas our truly hard bats, the nocturnal bat, which is number one, by the way, of our British bats, they're going to stay in the trees all year round. They don't care. They're hard as nails. They're going to hang out in the trees. And with trees and landscapes like this, who would blame them, right? So this is a nocturnal mating and hibernation roost in this tree. Cool. Let's move past winter, my least favorite time of year. And so we're heading into spring. So we've talked about the decline in insect food as we're heading into winter. As we get spring, of course, we get proliferation of spring flowers. So that's initially in the ground flora, but of course also on our trees and shrubs as well. So like willows, blackthorns, hawthorns, etc. And so with this initial burst of color and flowers, we get our initial flurry of insects. And species like goat willow, that is one of our earliest flowering species, is really important for our bats coming out of hibernation. They've had to see the tricky winter through, use their fat reserves that they built up in autumn, kind of manage that as effectively as they can. And come the spring, they want to get a meal in them as quickly as they can. And the flowers on goat willow are fantastic for attracting early insects and moths and things like that. So we need more of these flowers in our landscapes. And bats eat seasonally. Flowers come and go. You have kind of early ones and later ones. I still have some flowers in my garden at the moment. And so we need that succession of species flowering all the way through the summer to provide the insect food for the bats. And so just like if you get seasonal veg, you'll see that change through the year. The food that bats eat also changes through the year. And it's not just linked, of course, to things like flowers. We've talked about dung beetles already. Our saprophytic species, like stag beetles, are also really important food sources for our bats. So we need a kind of diversity of food sources for our bats. So as we head then into spring, and we're getting to maybe like May time, what are the bats doing in May, do you think? We've got mating, having babies, breeding, mating, giving birth. Yeah, so they're actually a little bit backwards. We're going to come on to mating, but we're actually starting the story here with giving birth. So the female bats will gather together in large roosts known as maternity colonies. This is 50 Bechstein's bats in this tree, in this cavity here, but they're not all as well insulated as that. Some species like our barbastelle bats will live beneath lifting bark. And as you can see, just one piece of lifting bark remains on this tree, that one there. And we have some barbastelles tucked underneath that piece of bark. So why do they come together then? Why do you think the females gather together? Have a dance off, safety in numbers, warmth for protection, nursery support, communal rearing. Yeah, absolutely. So there's kind of a number of reasons. Can you hear me still? I'm just checking. So I've had a notification on my phone, on my thing. You can do. Lovely. So my laptop said, can't hear anything. Yeah, so there's various reasons they come together. So protection might be one, like a bat creche might be another one. And of all wild animals, there's very few that show true altruism. And vampire bats are kind of jumping our shores at the moment here, away from the UK. But vampire bats are one of those species that show altruism. So if you roost communally and one of the bats feeds really well, it's a lovely meal of blood. They will come back, and if another bat hasn't fed as well, there's a kind of tax to pay, and they will regurgitate some blood to that bat, so the whole community as a whole survives. Quite interesting, right? Amazing. But one of the key reasons is warmth. So I showed you the lifting bark. This is the same tree, and bats of small mammals, they need to fly, so they have to use a lot of energy. And to rear young, they need to have a high metabolic rate. And of course, then there's a lot of heat that escapes to the environment, especially for species like this that choose to roost in such ridiculous locations like lifting bark that provides so little protection. And so, yes, coming together, and it's a bit like penguins on the ice. We know they come together and they kind of rotate round to avoid the really harsh conditions in the Antarctic. Bats kind of do the same. They group together to save energy, among a range of other kind of communal benefits they get from roosting together. So in this video here, you can see the mothers leaving, and that white ball of heat are the young bats left. And you can see one that came back, came back and lactated and fed the young for a bit, and they flew off again. So they were coming back every 20 minutes or so. But you can see the heat that the young are losing to their environment. They're born initially hairless and naked, so they kind of lose a lot of heat to the environment. And then the young will continue to grow. Eventually, the young get big enough and they can fly on their own. So I'm going to draw your attention to the Bechstein's bat that's located down in this part of the screen. You're going to see her move up through the slide in a second. So she kind of moves towards the hole. And what do we have here? We have the young bat tucked beneath her wing there. So going out and learning how to forage and how to feed on their own. And eventually, we're going to say goodbye to the bats and go to the hole. Eventually, they get full size and they learn from the parents. So the parent will pop off there and the young ones will hang around a bit. They need to groom, make sure they're nice and clean before they head out for the evening. You see the back foot coming in, scraping the bat there, and then the bat puts the toes in the mouth to get rid of anything that was loose in the fur. And by late July, early August, perhaps, then our bats are pretty much fully grown. This is a bat box that had about 121 Bechstein's bats in it. And I mentioned about heat already. The heat coming off of this box was immense when I put my hand into it. This is part of a long-term ringing study. And you can see, hopefully, some of the bats here. So we've got some with some jewelry on. So the ones with the jewelry on, hopefully you can notice they're brown, like these ones here, yeah? And then the ones without jewelry on, this one here, for example, the one in the middle here, slightly grayer. So those are the young of the year. I give it a few more weeks and they pretty much be indistinguishable from the adults. So there's only if you catch them at the right time that you can tell the difference. So what are the males doing then? But whilst this is all going on, the females are working hard, gathering together to give birth and rear young. What are the males doing? Nothing. Not far from the truth. Relaxing down the pub, absolutely. Well, they're kind of on their own, basically. That they don't have such high demands for energy requirement. So we talked about torpor and saving energy over the winter. And the bats can kind of do this, the male bats can do this on a daily basis. So why stay warm all day long when they can just kind of switch the functions off, cool down a little bit, save a bit of energy, wake back up for when it's getting dark again, and then head off and feed. So we know that some species of bats will roost on their own, a bit like this bat here. But we also do get some bachelor pads. So some species will form bachelor groups and come together as well. But the key difference essentially is that energy requirement. They don't need to take on as much food. And there's an amazing adaptation. So female bats are typically found in their best habitats. They emerge earlier, and this is all to give them the best chance to go out and get food so they can give birth and rear their young successfully. The male bats are then kind of pushed into the fringe habitats. They end up emerging later and foraging a bit further away as well to catch their food. And it's all about the species as a whole being successful rather than individual bats. This individual was actually a male pipistrelle setting up his mating roost. And here we have an illustration, another one from Amazing Ed, illustration of a nocturnal bat in his mating roost. So how do you think the bats attract their mates then? We had dance off mentioned earlier on, singing, dancing, the swagger, social calls, shouting cooey. Very nice, absolutely. They have a kind of a range of different approaches to finding a mate. So we have some bats that hold a territory. So as I mentioned, this is a nocturnal bat in its mating roost, and it does a few different things to attract mates. So it will scent mark around the entrance. So you can see the bats rubbing its neck around the entrance. I'm told they also put their saliva around the entrance, and their saliva is UV. I've got told that this year, and first time I've heard this. I need to go out next year with a UV torch at some of these roosts to see if I can find it. And of course, yes, they sing. So hopefully you can see the mouth of the bat here, opening and closing. This is a male bat singing. Is he successful? Of course he is. I'm not going to leave you hanging like that. Get in. And he carries on singing. Look at that, ruthless efficiency. So I mentioned earlier on there, a bit backwards, that we had bats giving birth before we mentioned mating. Bonkers, right? And so we see this technique in bats known as delayed fertilization, where they'll mate, a female store the sperm, and they don't fertilize the egg until the following year. And that's all to give the bats the best chance that when they come out of hibernation, they don't need to be faffing around, finding a mate and all that goes with that. They can get straight on, start feeding, and when it's ready, then give birth to their young. So an incredible adaptation. And then a final bit of what's happening at kind of the latter half of the year, August, September, October time. Here are our 3 resident pipistrelle bats. I saw the news that another Cully's bat was caught recently in the UK. So perhaps a species we're going to see more increasingly in the UK. But for now, just our 3 resident species. We've got the 2 on the right that are about the same size, common far right, soprano, middle. And then the slightly chunkier one, you just got that slightly bigger cousin. This is our Nethusiast pipistrelle on the left-hand side there. And I'm going to tell you a bit about a bat that was caught and ringed at this location. This is Blagden Lake, just south of Bristol. And Enthusiast pipistrelles are quite associated with open water bodies, whether it's coastlines, rivers maybe, or lakes like this. And a ring was put on this bat. And then a few months later, there was a call that this bat had been found in Holland. So it's this green line. Apologies for the kind of graininess of the image. This was taken from the Bat Conservation Trust have a national enthusiast project, and this was taken from their website. And we know in Europe that bats migrate, but the kind of classic British attitude was like, well, our bats don't, do they? Because they're different. We're British, right? And so there was evidence that bats were leaving the UK and going to Europe. And then the white and the yellow lines coming the other way from Latvia and Lithuania, where bats were ringed at ringing stations, so stations set up for birds, wading birds, things like that. And you can see the straight lines and about 1,500 kilometers in a straight line, presumably slightly longer than that. And as the project rolled on and more fantastic volunteers went out there and were catching bats and ringing bats, more and more of these movements were detected. So you can see predominantly coming in a northwest to southeast direction in the autumn, and then a southwest to northeast direction in the summer, basically, not dissimilar to when we kind of the movements we see in migrating birds. But just look at these distances. For a bat that's maybe 8 or 9 centimeters head to tail, really quite a small little animal to be flying these distances, and it doesn't stop there. It gets further and further and further. The record today, I believe, is in a straight line, 2,000 miles from the UK across to Russia. So such great distances that these bats are covering, and all under the cover of darkness and escaping our attention for so long. Now for the slightly less joyous part of the talk. I work in conservation. Overall, the picture in conservation isn't great, as denoted by this graph here. This is not just bats. This are kind of indicator species in the UK, and you can see it's an abundance index. Starting in 1970, that's when kind of fairly decent records were first taken. Presumably the decline started before that, but it's kind of, we don't have reliable data before that. So you can see this decline over time, and it's not great. And I'm sure those of you working in conservation and arboriculture will be aware of this. And looking at the headline figures then, estimations that we've lost pretty much all of our wildflower meadows, that we've lost huge amounts of hedgerows and those hedgerows trees that are associated with them. So I talked about perch hunting of the horseshoe bats. It's really simple that they just need somewhere to hang, an overhanging tree or a hedgerow that's overgrown slightly. But losing hedgerows, opening fields up, flailing hedgerows within an inch of their life, which is incentivized by our government's agricultural policies. Not fantastic for our native bats. And this has all essentially led to declines in insect numbers. And if you've got decline in insect numbers, then you're going to have declines in the numbers of the species that eat them. pesticide use, this isn't something new. This is a copy of Silent Spring. I'm sure many of you are familiar if not read this book. The copy I had is a second-hand copy, and you can see there, first published in 1965. And this spoke of the perils, mainly of DDT and a few other harsh chemicals. But the inevitable march of progress carries on, and Dave Gorson taking up the mantle in recent years, talking about insect apocalypses, and starting initially talking about bumblebees, but kind of heading out to all of our insects, essentially. And this is really kind of scary stuff. And coming out of the EU had many impacts for our wildlife species. One of them was that the neonicotinoids, which are now banned, these really aggressive chemicals which cause confusion in bees that essentially saw the collapse of bee colonies. They're banned in the EU. In the UK, we kind of end up in this cycle now because we regulate ourselves where temporary abatements are being granted by government to allow these chemicals to be used. And even if they are banned, the chemical companies will find the next thing to go and sell to their customers because it's a huge industry. And even for our woodland bats, so we're primarily thinking about agricultural pesticides here. Of course, we have them in domestic settings as well. But even in our woodland bats, where the pesticides, the herbicides, they don't just sit where they get sprayed, they drift. And so it's having impacts on species like our Bechstein's bats here, which are foraging around in the woodland, but it's because of the drift of these chemicals. We can add in things like the worming of livestock as well. So I talked about the importance of dung beetles for our horseshoe bats and the perch hunting that was illustrated earlier on. And we have worming treatments that, if fed to the livestock and then that allowed to be pooped out the other end on the pasture, will have a knock-on effect to our dung beetles and flies and all of the species that rely on that food resource. But there are simple ways that that can be managed in titrating dosages, allowing it to pass through the system in the barn, let it end up on the concrete rather than out on the grassland. But you can see it listed here as one of the threats for the greater horseshoe bat. Tree loss. We've talked about hedgerow loss already. There's multiple reasons why we've seen just trees systematically removed from our landscape, whether it's opening up field parcels, whether it's removing standing trees, whether it's lapses of management, so woodland health kind of declines overall, whether it's risk management, whether that's appropriate risk management or inappropriate risk management. Unfortunately, we're seeing really alarming declines in our species that are associated with trees. I've been privileged to work for some amazing organizations in my life. I worked for the Arbor Association. I currently work for a small charity called the Vincent Wildlife Trust. And I used to work for a small charity called the Ancient Tree Forum. And when I first started working there, we had a training course. And in that training course, it said 11% of European deadwood beetle species, or saproxylic species, are threatened. Within a few years, that had gone up to 18%. This is literally happening at a rate before our eyes. And it's not just saproxylic species. I've had direct experience of this. These are a barber-style roost that I located by radio tracking. So we put a little tag on a bat and then follow where it goes. And it turned up under this lifting bark on this wonderful sweet chestnut tree. And barber-style are really a species of the edge because they rely so much on lifting bark. They are very susceptible, very kind of weak features, essentially. And so they don't last forever. A couple of years at most, I guess. Unfortunately, that was preempted in this case, where the landowner came along and decided to deadwood these veteran trees. In the process, inadvertently damaging the bark that was used by bats. So the bark where the bats were was just down here. So you can kind of see this strip of damage of bark, and it's still there. It was still there immediately after the work, but it had lifted off the bark just that little bit more, making it unsuitable because the bats like to tuck themselves away. So we can wave goodbye to our barber-style maternity roost that was in that tree. And it's not just our rare species. This is one of the very first trees we found at my study site. And we've got Chris in the tree there, being very happy about the bats that he's found. And we went several times and we found nocturnal bats there in the winter. So this was a mating roost. and the male would attract the females in. He'd then sit in the entrance of it, and all the females would be up behind him, protected. And then during the summer months, we had natterers bats using it. Unfortunately, late 2022, early 2023, this had happened. In this instance, it was actually the wind that blew it over. It looks a bit worse in the photo here. It was just that the tree was ringed up whilst it was on the ground. So these roosts, they have a finite lifespan. Even if it's not a couple of years for lifting bark, it's not going to be forever. Ian Davison Watts spoke at the Bat Conference this year and talked about a woodpecker hole that he's been studying still being used by Bechstein's bats for a period of at least 25 years. How incredible is that? So they can be quite long-lived, but they're not going to last forever. So we can wave goodbye to our nocturals and our natterers bats in this tree. So what can we do about it? I think one of the big ones I mentioned about pesticide use is actually understanding where our food comes from. And it would be really easy for me to sit here and say, well, just eat organic food, just eat organic food. And I'm lucky enough that I can do that. I can factor that into my budget. I appreciate not everyone can do that. But I think just understanding where our food comes from is a really big issue. There's a current campaign going on by Riverford organic farmers about farm washing, about the supermarkets essentially lying to us, putting pictures of happy chickens on boxes and these lovely kind of pastel colors that they wrap their products in that make us think that they come from lovely countryside and the land is looked after, whereas the reality can be quite different. And I know that organic farming works. I mentioned that I work with the Vincent Wildlife Trust. We have a number of roosts, buildings that are secured primarily for horseshoe bats around the country. And there is one that is twice the size of any other greater horseshoe bat roost in the country. It's down in Devon. And next door is Riverford Farm. And so Vincent Wildlife Trust over the last 40 years have owned that site, and they've done fantastic work. A number of amazing bat workers involved in protecting, securing that site for the long term. Fantastic volunteers going down to study it as well each year. But when the bats leave our boundary, it's kind of up to the surrounding landowners to provide them with the food. And I think it's no coincidence that when they can go to Riverford and their organic farms, that the numbers really soar. Oh, I've gone the wrong way. So if we can't do that, what else can we do? So you might have heard of no mow May. If you're lucky enough to have a garden, let it grow. This is my garden. We moved in, and the guy who lived here before mowed every inch of it. That might not sound that mad until I tell you we live on the edge of the Cotswold Escarpment, so on a fairly steep hill, and the garden is 60 meters long. And so he built his own extension lead that allowed him to mow the garden. This photo on the left-hand side there was an area that he cleared of some scrub, and all of these wildflowers came up. And as we were buying the house, he said, oh, I might just rip all this out and put some grass down. And I had to say, please don't. Please leave it. And you can see the wonderful flowers there. On the right-hand side, when we didn't mow the grass the following year, we had an amazing assortment of flowers that came up. We had 14 pyramidal orchids, 2 common spotted orchids, a range of primroses, cowslips, and yes, they're introduced, but of course they're producing nectar and pollen for the invertebrates. The invertebrates then go on to feed our bats. When it comes to tree management, it's a really simple mantra. I know that many people will be out there involved in risk management, and that's always at the fore of your mind. But I think there's a really simple message, especially when it comes on to species like barbastelle, and that's just keep deadwood as long as possible. And for barbastelle, if you can keep it until all the bark falls off, that value has been and gone. And you're giving that bat a chance to jump from one stepping stone to the next stepping stone to the next stepping stone. And I can see it on trees as I go back and study them, that a piece of bark comes off, but then the bats just move up to the next bit on the tree, and they can kind of just move throughout the tree itself. Cool. What else can we do? So I'm just going to give you a bit of a hint of a study that I'm involved with. We are lucky enough to have got some funding from the People's Trust for the Endangered Species, the ARB Association. Thank you very much. and be supported by steel as well. And we're looking at creating bat roosts in trees. And this is borrowing from and inspired by the great work that Vicky Bengtson and others are doing on veterinization. And they were having bats turning up in their features. And so we thought, well, they didn't design theirs for bats. What would happen if we actually designed ours for bats? So we're working with two species. They're slightly hidden behind the shroud there. They're going to appear when I come on to the next slide. And so we're looking at Barbastelle and Bechsteins, our tree specialists. The Bechsteins is a void dweller on the right-hand side. The Barbastelle is a crevice dweller, so kind of different techniques. And we're looking at things like whether we can create instant roosts, like in the photo here, where we cut out a wedge, like a bat box in a tree, as well as future roosts as well. So this is kind of predicting, wounding a tree, predicting how it's going to respond, and hopefully creating suitable habitats for bats. And we have some resources coming. So in short, the answer is it works. We're finding a number of bat species using it. I appreciate there's a nuanced message here that we shouldn't be doing it to all trees. It's fundamentally a tool in the toolbox, that if the site's right, if the trees are right, then it might be appropriate to do it. We've been working with a videographer who has managed to capture what we've been up to. So we've got some instructional videos coming soon, as well as some plans, which will be put out through our social media channels, which is Bats RTS. They will be on the final slide. And not just what we've been up to, but the successes as well. Cool. I'm going to pick you up. I'm not going to leave you in the dip of despair when we talk about pesticides and herbicides and the decline in insects and changes in landscape. Let's talk about something a bit more entertaining. So I haven't really got onto invasive species, but this is you might recognize this bat here. We saw him earlier on. This is a nocturnal bat at his mating roost. This is a little bit before we saw him earlier on, so we wound the clock back to July now. And this is a nocturnal bat coming back to his mating roost. And would you know it, a grey squirrel is in residence. For those of you not in the UK, nocturnal bat is our biggest bat. It's probably 12, 13 centimeters long. What's that in metric? 3 inches, 3.5 inches maybe. Grey squirrel is about 26 centimeters tall, much, much bigger. But that doesn't put this bat off. And he flies away initially, then he comes back, and the squirrel's not happy about it, and the squirrel's throwing punches from inside the hole there. And eventually the bat thinks, well, sod it, I'm going in. That squirrel is in a world of pain. I think despite their size difference, think about if you were at home and there's a door open on your house and you have no lights and you can hear an intruder coming in, an intruder that's happy in the nighttime, that's got big teeth designed for crushing beetles. It doesn't matter how big you are. I think it's quite clear that you're going to lose. And if there's any doubt in that, the bat comes out afterwards, the nocturnal bat, and carries on singing away. He won that fight, absolutely. I had 2 cameras on this tree. It was picked up by the other camera, not with this one, but there was like a squirrel-shaped blur between these videos as the squirrel ran away. If there's any doubt about the nocturnal winning this fight, you can see there, 23rd of July, just after 11 o'clock at night. A few hours later, the following morning, the bat's at it again, rubbing his neck, scent marking away, trying to attract the females in. Absolutely hench, full of testosterone. Cool. Okay, I'm coming close to wrapping up. Just a couple of announcements. A number of people have asked about the bat hoodies, the bat t-shirts, and I'm very pleased to say that the T-mail store is now open. So if you want to scan the QR code, that will take you to it. It was on the final slide as well. It'll be coming up in a second. I've started at the moment just with kind of men's and ladies line. I will be adding some kids lines as well. If you want to buy little ones in your family some Christmas gifts, they will be coming soon. I just need a bit more time to get it set up. And then coming in the new year as well will be a Bats and Trees masterclass training course. So this QR code will take you to a link to kind of express an interest in that. I'm just asking for names and email addresses at the moment. When it's ready, I'll email everyone to let you know, and I'll offer you a discount as well. So this is training, learn on demand training designed for ecologists, arborists, foresters, landscape architects, people who are just generally interested in bats. If you want to learn more about bats and specifically trees, this is the course for you. So that's me. The 2 QR codes are there. If you haven't already done so, why not pop over to social media? I'm on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook at BatsRTS. There's lots of posts coming out about these amazing creatures. I'm so lucky to work with these animals and be able to present them to the world for people to get as excited about them as I do. If you head over to the YouTube channel, which is just at Bats in Trees, you'll see a whole range of resources and videos there as well. Thank you so much for listening.
Hey, well done, Jim. I say this every time, but you're all right at this. I think you should do more of this. You're pretty good. Lots of love for you, Jim.
Lots of love coming in. Very much appreciated. Thank you.
I like the model.
I'm amazed so many people are coming to listen about bats. What better way? Hopefully you're all ready for Halloween now.
The model of that photo.
Can't hear you, John.
In that photo with the.
Have you been talking for a while?
Huh?
Or are you talking to yourself?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I cannot hear you. Am I going to carry on? I'll carry on for another hour. Is this my cue?
Other people can hear me, but you can't hear me. So this is
never been more attractive, John, when I can see you but can't hear you.
This is going to be difficult because other people can hear me, but you can't hear me. This is going to be tough. Yeah, but they can. Look at the chat.
Cool. I'll shut up.
Can you hear me now? Oh, wow. How are we going to do this, folks? I feel like some sort of miming question is going to be in order here. I mean, this is a new problem we've got. I'm going to call him. Shall I call him? I'll call it. I'm going to call you. Don't worry about it. At least he's not gone for his chip butter yet. I'm going to call him. And then I'm going to ask him all your questions and it's all going to be fine and we'll pretend this never happened. So I'm calling Jim.
2 seconds, John. I've got to change my webcam.
What are you doing that's more important than answering the phone to me?
The phone was being used as a webcam. There we go. Right, let me grab my phone.
I've reached your voicemail, Jim. Oh my God. I've just reached his voicemail, folks. This is how it works. You get Ted Green answering the phone while we're trying to do a webinar, and we get Jim's voicemail. Hello, Jim. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
This is amazing. And everybody can hear Jim, so we're going to do it this way. And there's nothing weird about that at all. And this is how all professional things work. Great.
You pay extra for this feature, don't you?
I think we should, because people love it, because they're here not for the nonsense. They're here purely for the bats. So thank you, Jim. You're wonderful. I was saying initially how great you were, but now I retract that. But you were great. We've had loads of questions. We've got 91 questions, which is the most number of questions we've ever had, I think. And I'm feeling quite lazy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work from the top to the bottom. We're going to see how many we get through in the next 25 minutes. And that's what we're going to do. Jim, relatively short answers. Let's just see how we crack through. Question 1 from Oscar. Do you have any background or advice on converting World War II pillboxes to bat roosts?
It's not something I've been directly involved. Oh, hold on. I've got my light on my phone. It's all going on here, isn't it? Right.
Bats, folks. That's what he does.
It's not something I've got direct experience of. Essentially, when you're thinking about creating hibernation sites, it's all about stability. And so you want to minimize airflow as much as you can. And that will give you nice stable temperatures and high humidities as well. I think if you approach organizations like the Canal and River Trust, I know that they have a number on their estates and they might have people who can advise you more. Who knows, we might have some people in this audience that might be able to advise on that. But I think that's as much as I can say.
Thank you, Jim. Sue says, how can you tell the difference between soprano, pipistrelle, and common?
They were found initially when the technology around bat detectors began to evolve and the echolocation calls are different. So the name soprano comes from the fact that the echolocation calls are higher. So they're about 45 kilohertz for common and 55 kilohertz for soprano. There's various other things you can look at. Head to my YouTube page at Bats in Trees, there are instructional videos on how to identify British bats coming out in the new year. I just was texting with him today. James Shipman is also bringing out a field guide on bats, which will be a very unique take on Bat ID. So make sure you look out for that. I think you can pre-register now for a discount as well from Pelagic Publishing.
Marvelous, thank you. Earlier on, when you showed one of the pictures, you described the soprano as being on the far right. So I was hoping the answer would be that you might see that one at a Tommy Robinson demonstration, but that's probably going too political. We'll edit that out at the end.
I missed that.
Yeah, if anyone's offended, we'll edit that bit out. Jill says, "Oh, there's more shocked faces than laughy faces. Is that bad? I don't understand. It's so hard to know these days." Jill says, "Are most of the insects that these bats are catching out at night?"
Yes, so that's when our bats in the UK are active. The insects, we have this wonderful term. So I talked about aerial hawking earlier on, and that can only happen if the insects are on the wing. So you need to have good conditions, warm temperatures for that example. And we have this amazing term called crepuscular, which means more active around dusk and dawn. So when you get more insects around dusk and dawn, you get more bat activity then as well. But our species that glean or feed on the ground, they can catch bats, catch prey wherever, because they don't need to be on the wing. But yes, all happening at night.
Crepuscular is one of my very favourite and underused words, so kudos for that. Oscar says, "Is climate change, or how is climate change affecting UK bats?"
I think the simple answer is that as of yet, we don't know. We can model, and there's various researchers looking into this. It's not something I am directly involved with. So who's the person I'm thinking of? Orly Razgar is doing some work on genomics, and saw her present at the European Bat Research Symposium as well as the Bat Conference this year about the bats in the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain and Portugal. And what they're doing there is looking at how climate change will affect the climate there, and then the habitats, and then looking at the genomics of the genes within species. And I don't quite know how they're doing this, but some within the same species like it hotter and drier, some like it wetter. And the prediction is that, okay, they can model for this, and they say, okay, well, hotter and drier, you're probably going to get a bit more of that. But the ones that like it slightly cooler and wetter, they're going to get squeezed out. So they're working at looking at a landscape scale to see if they can connect up these habitats to allow a pathway for the bats to move. Because if you imagine the habitats and the climate they have in Spain at the moment, if it gets too hot and dry, it's going to force them further north potentially. So we might see increasing numbers of bats moving, species moving from south to north, but we don't really know. And I think the simple answer is there will be winners and there will be losers.
Thank you, Jim. I said I'd ask from top to bottom. I'm going to make an exception to that because we've got a question from Theo, age 9. And Theo asks, "Do bats have lungs or air sacs like birds so that they're able to fly, or do they have normal lungs because they're a mammal?"
They have lungs like us, yeah. So I think the best thing to remember really is they're mammals. They're not that dissimilar to us. They have just evolved this amazing ability to fly, and they do it so differently from birds. We tend to lump them together because they're both up in the sky, but they're very, very different. Yeah. So they're like us. And they, in fact, we mentioned echolocation earlier on. It's very expensive. Lots of energy required to fly around and to echolocate. So one of the ways they save energy is when they compress the muscles and beat the wings, they can also compress their lungs and the diaphragm to force the echolocation sound out. So they're getting kind of more bang for their buck.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you, Theo. Great question. Jocelyn has asked, "Do bats eat the crusty bits of old and dead bark in crevices?"
Not that I'm aware of, no. As far as I'm aware, in the UK at least, they're insectivorous. They're looking for the kind of whole myriad of insects and invertebrates to feed on rather than the tree itself.
Ryan asks, "What's the gestation period of bats?" Because you mentioned there's one offspring per year.
Yeah, so on the whole, it's one per year. Some species may have twins. So Leisler's bats is a species that may occasionally have twins. It varies. So it can be between maybe 2 or 3 weeks to 5 to 6 weeks. And that depends on the species of bats, but also the conditions at the time. So I mentioned earlier on that they come together to keep warm. They need lots of food available. So if you've got good conditions and the mothers are able to feed well before they give birth, get lots of food once they've given birth to rear their young, keep nice and warm, it can happen much faster. If the weather's not as good, if there's not as much food around, that will be slowed down. And I know there's studies looking at the single most important factor in a bat's health will be how much rainfall happened before it was born, in the spring before it was born, because that determines how healthy the mother is, essentially.
Thank you very much. We've got a couple of questions about how long bats live for. So Nikki has said, excuse me, how long do bats generally live for and which UK bats live for the longest? And James has asked, has anyone done any studies on the age or longevity of bats and which species live the longest?
Yeah, so they're really quite interesting as small mammals go. So they're very different. If you think about what the common conception of the bats, people talk about flying mouse, and in German, Fledermaus, winged mouse. And they're very different for that. So the mice, rodents live fast, die young, and they have lots of litters, and each litter there's multiple offspring, and they put very little parental care into that. It's kind of a numbers game, basically. Bats are different, so they put much more parental care into rearing their young like we do, and so they can be quite long-lived. I think the record in the UK is 28 years. There's a greater horseshoe bat near Bath. I believe for a UK species, it's somewhere in the high 40s, and that's a Brandt's bat. So that's a species we have here, but that's in Siberia. So if you think about Siberia, they're probably asleep longer than they are awake because it's so cold. Um, and bats, there are people currently looking into the genes of bats. So if you think about how we age, and you see as your parents, grandparents, etc., get older, you like things like wrinkles set into skin and it's not quite as plump, and you see those signs of aging. Um, that essentially comes from the fact that DNA is copied. And it's like making a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. Just eventually degrades a bit over time. It kind of unwinds, the DNA unwinds in its strands. Bats actually have caps on their telomeres on the DNA, which stop it unwinding or slow that process down. And I know there are researchers looking into whether like gene therapy can be applied, and that technique kind of was dropped into humans' genes, which I find a bit terrifying, to be honest. I think we're probably around on this earth for long enough already without messing around like that. But I'm sure some evil henchman, villain somewhere will be funding that kind of research.
It's just what the world needs is humans around for a bit longer because
Absolutely.
we've got a fantastic track record so far. We have got so many questions. We're definitely not going to get through them all, but we will send Jim all of the questions, and if any of them tickle his fancy, he can get back to you in time. Hazel asks, why do bats hang upside down?
So if you think about I'll put my phone down. I can hear myself and I've got my phone next to me. You think about what they're doing with their hands. They're using them to fly. And so it's kind of the only option they've got. They can land and crawl into things. But when we typically thinking of bats hanging upside down, there's very few species that do that. So our horseshoe bats I mentioned earlier on, the ones that evolved in caves, they fly in and out of openings in buildings or in caves, and they had to kind of fly in and then hang up. So that's why, because they can't do it with their hands. But most of our bats, our Vesper bats, so the ones which aren't horseshoes, they kind of wedge themselves into things, or they sit in the bottom of a woodpecker hole, maybe looking upwards. So it's only really a small number of bat species that hang upside down.
Thank you. So it is children friendly this evening, and Rowan, who's 4, asked about how old bats can get, and you've already dealt with that. So great question, Rowan. Thank you. But also Ash, who is 6, has asked, what is the biggest wingspan of a UK bat? What's our biggest bat, Jim?
Okay, so this comes down to whether you count having 17 or 18 bats, I guess. I'm going to start with 17. It's our biggest one is kind of a bit of a tie between either noctule or greater horseshoe, and that's a kind of approaching 30 centimeters-ish wingspan. But if you include the greater mouse-eared bat, The bat that we've got a couple of individuals hanging on, and one of them was a juvenile, so there's questions about whether it's a breeding species. They're a little bit bigger than that. And to be honest, off the top of my head, I don't know. I've never seen that bat in the wild. I've never seen that bat myself. So I know it's bigger than the other two species, so a little bit bigger than that. So I'm guessing probably like 35 centimeters at a push, 40 centimeters.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rowan and Ash. Brilliant stuff. We've had a couple of questions, practical questions about bat boxes.
Okay.
One is from an anonymous attendee. How mysterious. And one of them is from Tracy. And basically, the question is, how high up a tree should you install your bat box?
So I think it comes down to how long your ladder is, really, is the simple answer there. And there was a thought initially that bats need to be up high. And so when I first started studying bats, we used to take a double extension ladder into the woods to get to our bat boxes. They were so high up and it was so much effort lugging that thing around. To kind of flip it round and think about where we find them naturally, the lowest bat in a tree in the UK, I believe the record is currently 26 centimeters above ground. So I think the reality is that we need to give them more credit than they need to be up high. They can be pretty much anywhere they want. If you think about the species that land and crawl on the ground, they're down at that level happily anyway. The trade-off with being low down is that you may be closer to predators. So I didn't include any videos here, but we, in our cameras on our study, we're having stoats visiting pretty much every single cavity in a tree, every single woodpecker hole. And it's a numbers game. I guess they'd go around and hopefully find something eventually. And I do have I kept it children friendly, but I do have like a time lapse stop motion clip of stoats eating baby squirrels. I thought we were before the watershed. So I just showed you the more kid friendly of the bat beating up the squirrel. So yeah, there's a trade-off there, and I think lower down we still get things like wood mice and voles up in the canopy of trees, but I think you'd get even more of those lower down. So if you're in something like hibernation where you're not particularly active and you choose to roost low down, you get a benefit from maybe stabler conditions lower down. It's less likely the tree's less likely to split. Temperatures is going to be perhaps more stable, but you maybe put yourself at a greater predation risk. So using that, I think you don't need to be precious about it. Put it wherever you think is most appropriate. People used to talk about south facing, but the reality is that bats need variety. So try to find a tree or a side of a building where there's maybe a bit of vegetation nearby, but it's not blocked entirely. If a box is out on its own, it's a bit like a bird feeder being out in the middle of the garden. They're not going to visit it. Give it a bit of cover, a bit of shelter, because there's all sorts of predators like sparrowhawks, owls that will try and take bats. So give them a bit of shelter so they can sneak out.
Thank you. So, because we've mentioned predators and because you mentioned before the watershed, I want to ask Rebecca's question, which is, I think, one of the grimmest questions we've had on a webinar. Rebecca says, I've read that great tits rather brutally eat bats by pecking open their skull case, and the bats then die an awful slow death. Is this behavior rare, or are they a threat to bat populations?
So I'm loosely aware of this study. It's not one that I've read myself. And I think there's something similar around wood mice as well. My understanding is that these are bats that are in hibernation, in torpor, so they just aren't able to respond very quickly. And it's at a time of year when there's perhaps less food available. So I understand that it happens. I've never witnessed it myself. I think there are probably greater risk and greater predators to bats than blue tits, to be honest. Happy to be proved wrong. I know there was a study that found nocturnal bats mixed in with starling chicks in the spring, like cohabiting in cavities, and there's various researchers like Morgan Hughes in the UK is finding different species of bats roosting together. So this idea that you just get like one bat and that's it, or one species and that's it. The reality is that our trees are habitats. And they're kind of used like a timeshare. So something will move in, like nesting birds come in the spring, build their nest, they rear their young, they disappear. And then other species come in. And the cameras I've had up through the whole year kind of show this soap opera playing out. So you get like grey squirrels moving in for a bit, and they get turfed out by green woodpeckers, and eventually the green woodpeckers move. Then you get bats moving in, and then the squirrels come back, and then other birds come in. So it's a constant kind of flux of animals moving around. But I think it's when they're in hibernation, they potentially are vulnerable.
Thank you, Jim. What I've learned there, folks, is that according to Jim Mullholland, if you want to crack open a bat's skull, wait till it's sleeping. That's what I've learned from tonight. So thank you, Jim. So we've had some questions.
CEO of the Arbor Association, this is.
Nah, I'm not working now, am I? It's like 7:20, for God's sake. No. We've had a few questions about getting started in your field of work, and I picked out Libby's question from the chat. You're very lucky, Libby, because it's in the chat, not the Q&A. But Libby says, I'm 19, currently in my first year of university studying wildlife and conservation management, considering a career in bat ecology. Do you have any tips in progressing towards this career, and sort of any pros and cons to doing so?
Yeah, sure thing. It is a really challenging industry to break into. And like so many things in conservation, there's various barriers. And if you think about the kind of diversity of people we have working in conservation, it's not great. And there's a kind of legacy there of people that have the time, that have the money, that can go and study these things. And to draw a comparison, so I trained in ecology initially, worked as an ecologist for a while. I then trained in arboriculture. And when I trained as an ecologist, I had to get a degree. Whilst I was studying my degree, I was studying bats for my license. And after I finished my degree, I volunteered for 9 months before I could get my first ecology job. Working in arboriculture, when I studied, I did an A-level equivalent qualification. I could walk out with that qualification into the same level of job that I got with the degree and 9 months of volunteering. And so there's kind of quite a stark difference in between the two industries. And there's kind of, when you observe them, there's various things going on like that. I think if you are studying and you've got the time, I benefited hugely from studying bats whilst at university because I had spare time. You might not think you've got spare time now, but wait until you get a job because that very quickly disappears. So if you can fit it in and get that ball rolling now, that's perhaps the best thing to do. Have a look on the Bat Conservation Trust website, and hopefully you can find a bat group local to you. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a postcode lottery with, depending on, they're run by volunteers, so depending on whether they're active or not, and whether they have capacity to take people out. One of the great things about social media is that it connects people wherever you are. So if you are struggling, if you're on Facebook, head over to UK Bat Workers. There is a tree climbing for bats page on there that's not particularly active. There's also things like UK ecology jobs and things like that. So there's people posting, and you tend to see posts at all different levels in the industry. So I think the best thing is kind of put feelers out, see how you get on. You might be like me. I was very lucky that we found someone to take us out when we were studying, but I hear lots of horror stories that people really, really struggle. But that's kind of one of the reasons why I put so much content out and lots of free learning resources like micro learning as well, and do talks like this, that if people are struggling to get that practical experience, then maybe they can do a bit of self-guided study. Maybe if they've got enough money, they can get a bat detector and go out and start observing bats and studying bats that way. And I know that's not for everyone. I'm quite happy to sit down, read a book, and then go out and look at these things, but I appreciate that not everyone learns in the same way. But yeah, give that a go. There's lots of great people, and the more and more young people coming into the industry now, I think so many of them experience those barriers trying to get into it, that they are looking to the next generation and thinking, well, I want to be a bit more helpful. So it is improving.
Thanks, Jim. On a similar theme, we've had a good question that I think is really, really important. It's from an anonymous attendee. I don't know who you are, but it's a great question. Thank you. About, are there jobs within the bat world that a wheelchair user could do? And I know one of my great frustrations I often talk about is that in arboriculture, the way that our qualification system is set up is essentially if you were in a wheelchair, you wouldn't really be able to progress in a career in arboriculture particularly well because almost all of the entry level qualifications require tree climbing, chainsaw use, and the same goes for people who are scared of heights, for lots of people, and it's very restrictive. Is that the same in the bat world, or is there more opportunities for people using wheelchairs?
It's a really interesting question. And I think to a certain extent, there's some similar challenges. So if you think about where ecologists will spend most of their time, they're out and about in not dissimilar areas to people working in arboriculture. I guess the slight advantages that people in arboriculture over forestry have is that there's maybe some more urban work. And in ecology, and in bats in particular, it kind of depends what you want to do. So I when I was employed initially as a consultant, most of my work was on buildings, and buildings are generally a bit more accessible. There's lots of work to do with emergent surveys where you have surveyors positioned around a building watching bats come out with night vision equipment and bat detectors. And some of those, maybe even most of them, probably not all of them, will be relatively accessible, assuming you can get transport to site, I guess. But there's also back office work as well. So there's things like sound analysis, and we're seeing a bit of a transition now from manual echolocation call analysis to more automated processing. But there's still a certain amount of sound analysis or reviewing video footage that needs to be done after surveys. And so I think there are definitely opportunities for that. And then things like report writing as well, if people have those skills, and I appreciate it wasn't one of my great strengths when I first started in the industry, but there are various desk-based tasks, and I've seen a few posts from people who, for example, when they have young children and can't get out in the same way that they used to be able to get out, and offer their services for kind of more like remote working, desk-based things like maybe reporting or proofreading or call analysis. So yeah, it's not something I have direct awareness of myself, but there's potential there at least, I guess.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jim. Good answer and great question. And speaking for arboriculture, arboriculture should be for everybody. There really shouldn't be any limitations on arboriculture, and I'm sure our colleagues in ecology feel exactly the same way. Have you got like 10 minutes longer than we scheduled in for, Jim? Or you got a chip butty coming?
When do you want to finish?
I'm asking because it's 7:30. We've got 1 minute to go. We've got 530.
Oh, I thought we were going to quarter to 8.
Oh, yeah, we were going to quarter to 8. That's what I meant. So from quarter to 8, we might do another 5 minutes. Great. Thanks, Jim. Quarter to 8. That's exactly what I was thinking. So ignore that question. Right. So somebody's latched onto the fact that I'm feeling uncharacteristically sympathetic towards children this evening. So I'm going to ask some more children's questions, like the TV host on children's TV I was destined to be. Karina, aged 8, has asked, where do bats rest when they're crossing the ocean?
Oh, wow. I mentioned about the Thusius pipistrelle and those great migrations from Europe across the UK. And it was rumoured for a while. I remember when I first started studying bats that this might be happening. As I say, our colleagues in Europe kind of knew it was happening. But I remember it being discussed because some of these bats were turning up on oil rigs or ferries crossing the ocean. I'm sure now with the increase in things like other things going on in the ocean, maybe even like wind turbines, if they're not active, there might be kind of places they can hang out. But the short answer is that once they cross, they have to finish it. And so they have to kind of be able to get all the way across in one go, unless there's something like an oil rig or a passing boat that they could kind of land on. Yeah, because they have no other option, basically.
Good stuff. Thank you. And good question, Karina. A few people have asked this question, but I'm going to go for Alyssa, who is aged 11. I just want to say to everybody, you can't just ask a question from now on and say, I'm aged 7.5. It's not going to work. I'm on to you. But Alyssa, who's 11, says, Jim, what is your favourite bat?
My favorite bat is the one I'm wearing. This is the nocturnal bat, and that's because there's a couple of reasons for that. They have silky brown fur. They are the only bat species in the UK that sees the whole year through in trees, and I think that in itself is enough of a reason. They look like BMW cars. If you look at them straight on, the headlights look like the nostrils. It's like an old series, not the new ones. And how can you not love a bat that takes on a grey squirrel and wins?
Marvelous answer and good question. Thank you, Alyssa. Another anonymous attendee question, which I don't normally indulge, but I'm going to, because the question is, are some bats herbivores?
Oh, interesting. So in the UK, we think of our species as feeding predominantly on insects. You do get some kind of frugivore species or pollen-eating species or nectar-eating species elsewhere in the kind of tropics and elsewhere in the world. I don't know a great deal about those species or their ecology, so I guess if they're eating nectar or they're eating fruits, they're kind of herbivores, right? And so these are the fantastic species that do so much great work pollinating plants and crops. So the list of fruits that we wouldn't have without bats because they pollinate them, things like tequila, if you're um, what's the word I'm looking for? If you're fond of a tipple of that,
An
you
alcoholic.
wouldn't have these things without these bats. If you are interested in the bats that pollinate tequila, there's a fantastic documentary called The Batman of Mexico. And incredible individual, along with other huge number of other people working on the conservation of the species that moves from Mexico into the United States. And how do you conserve a species that operates over that range when things like the flowers on certain cacti open at certain times of year and climate change is affecting that? You've got industrialization and impacts on these commuting routes heading up through. But it's one of the success stories, and we have so few of those success stories. I mentioned greater horseshoe bat earlier on. In the UK, that's one of our great success stories, that it got down to a really low number of bats, and now they're on the increase again, and they're even spreading out into kind of re-establishing into their former range. So it used to be, when I started bats 19 years ago, it used to be very much restricted to the southwest. But now we're getting them as far across as Sussex, and there's a project going on at the moment looking to see if we can facilitate them. But the Batman of Mexico focuses on this species that pollinates tequila. There's a moment in it which I can still remember now, and the hairs stand up on the back of my neck, on my arm, which is, we don't work in conservation to put species on the endangered list. We work in conservation to take them off. And it was the first species to be taken off of that red list through fantastic work of all those scientists.
Very good. Thank you. And I only drink tequila to help the bats. So
Fantastic. What an altruist.
Who's the greater bat hero? You or me? I'll leave it to the audience to
Just
decide.
bananas and tequila. That's all you have.
Bananas and tequila is all I consume, and it's actually my username on certain websites. What could be a very quick answer is, a few people have commented on how wonderful the drawings and the cartoons you showed were. Could you share the name of the artist again, just with everybody?
Yes, his name is Ed Harrison. Let me find his details. He's currently having a bit of time off. I had a message from him earlier this week saying he's taking a bit of time off, but he's well worth following. He does various different things. I'll drop the web link in the chat. He's done some amazing like origami moths, and he sent me one of the elephant hawk moth, which is incredible. He does various bits of artwork. As I say, he's taking a bit of time off at the moment, so he may not be available, but his work is incredible. He's working on a project called Under the Skin, and this is where they're looking at endangered species, and they have these artworks which are really beautiful in their own right. And then when you scan them with a UV torch, their skeletons are illuminated. And when you take a smartphone or a tablet to them, you get an augmented reality process coming out. It tells you more about the species and their threats. Really, really amazing stuff of blending kind of that art, that technology, along with conservation. He's truly an inspiring individual.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I should though it kills me inside to say it, I'm going to read Stephen's comment, which is excellent presentation. Thank you, Jim. You should be on TV. You're a great communicator. Great to have such a knowledgeable young person.
Thank you so much. It's very kind.
It pains me. I'm just communicating the message. And of course, you are on TV, aren't you, Jim? Because you're a doyen of the One Show and Country File and all that sort of thing.
That's right, indeed. Yeah. And you're such an amazing communicator as well, John. Is that what you want to hear?
Oh, you. All I'm reading is apparently I look like Tim Key, who I think I know who that is. Not sure how happy I am, but thanks everyone.
I've bigged you up before, John, but it's worth saying it again that the changes that you brought about during your time in charge of the Arbor Association, your strive for inclusivity and diversity. I remember the first meeting when you were talking about conference and said that we should have a 50-50 split of men and women, and the people in the room looked at you like you were insane. And it's such a simple, such an obvious thing, but it took you to come along to actually think of it and then deliver on it, and you continue to do great stuff. So you know you're great, John. Of course you do.
No, you're crying. You're crying. Thank you, Jim. That wasn't what I was going for, but thank you, darling. Okay, what have we got? We've got like 7 or 8 minutes left, and there's so much stuff I want to ask. What is the collective noun for bats?
I don't know. Is there one? A colony?
I don't know. I mean,
can we make one up? Someone else in the audience might know if there is one. Just put some stuff in the chat, and we'll go with our favourite.
If you know the collective noun for bats, then please do pop it in the
cauldron.
Chat. Cauldron, bevy. Oh goodness, where are we going with this? So there's so many questions now, and we've got 79 questions still. Here's a good question. While we're answering the what's our favourite name for the collective noun for bats, Roman has asked, do bats interact with plants and fungi for medicinal purposes?
Ooh. I have no idea.
Good question, isn't it?
It's fantastic. Yeah, it would make sense that they do, right? With bats, one of the reasons I find it so fascinating is because they are so understudied, and it's relatively. I talked about the barriers earlier on of the equipment, maybe in the UK, the licensing associated with it, and the kind of skill set you need to develop. But once you get past that initial hurdle, there's so much that can be researched and so much that we can learn. In the time I've worked with bats, our knowledge about bats and trees has increased vastly, largely due to one chap called Henry Andrews, but the collection of people that supported the Bat Tree Habitat Key project. If you're not aware of that, it's worth popping along and having a look at it if you're interested in bats and trees specifically. They have a book called Bat Roosts and Trees, but also lots of free resources on the website, Bat Tree Habitat Key. But yeah, I have no idea. I'm worth go and research it, go and find out. That can be the next topic.
Jack has asked, what's the impact of estates and landowners putting Christmas lights up in veteran trees at this time of year?
It's a tricky one, I guess, that we know the bats are less active, but they will still be active to a certain extent. I think if you compare it to lighting that's on all year round and is on all the way through the night, it's probably not as much because they're going to be switched on at certain times and then switched off when people go home because people aren't going to be walking around in the dark all night long. I think there is potential for lights to be put up on trees that are used by bats. You would hope that people like that would actually go through and conduct surveys. And I have heard of people involved in those types of schemes, either for festivals or for those kind of winter night light things where they go through and do an assessment. I think it might even be, if they need a license from the council, it might be a requirement to get surveys in some instances.
Thank you. We've had lots of questions on this kind of theme, so I'm not going to attribute it to anybody particularly. Lillian, I suppose, has asked this, which is people wanting to know what they can do to benefit bats, and you've mentioned some of the ways and various sort of, letting grass grow along, etc. But people are asking about, is there food they can put out for bats? Some of the arboriculturalists are asking what they can do when managing trees for bats. Obviously, it's a broad kind of question, but for the people watching, is there anything really they could do? Maybe one answer for arboriculturalists, one answer for people who don't work with trees that they could do to really help conserve bats.
Yeah, sure. So for people outside of arboriculture, I think it's not like birds where you can put seeds out or mealworms. They will eat insects. So we want landscapes that are full in a kind of diversity of insects. So if you are lucky enough to have a garden, I think it comes back to those principles of thinking about flowering plants, thinking about dead wood in your garden, water sources, and think about that succession of species all through the year. So you don't just have flowers at one time, but you have them staged throughout the year. It could be as simple as thinking about the lighting around your house. If you have a security light that is left on the outside of your house, can it be switched off, or can it be put on a passive infrared trigger to limit it, and a short timer so it's on when you need it, but then doesn't stay on the whole night. If you've got a cat, keep it indoors around dusk and dawn if you can. And that's the kind of the time period when bats are leaving their roosts. And cats are very clever animals. And if there's enough bats in a building, they can just sit there, wait, and swipe at them. The number of whole range of wildlife species that cats bring indoors. But yeah, I think maybe hopefully one of those might be of use for people working in arboriculture. I think it's appreciating the value that trees have, and arboriculture grew out off as a kind of an offspring of forestry, where the original value of tree was timber value, that commercial value. We then saw in the 60s this idea of aesthetics and the sense of place of being around trees. We're now moving on and talking about the ecosystem services, so mitigating climate change, cleaning air, mitigating for floods, as well as the ecology. So we need to look at the value that trees have in the round, because if we appreciate that something is valuable, when we're making decisions, that will be factored in. With the origins of arboriculture, people didn't understand that dead wood was valuable, that it was an important resource for a range of species. And so it just didn't enter into the equation. So understanding that, I talked when we did the last webinar, I talked about blending skills of the ecologists and arborists, and I think it raised maybe the hackles of a few arborists in the room. And I think it was unintentional. That it definitely wasn't intentional. What I was commenting on is when I trained as an arboriculturalist, standard curriculum didn't really do much on ecology. It's scraping the surface, but it's getting better, I think. And there's lots of free resources out there now. So the Ancient Tree Forum have got great stuff. The Vet Tree, the Vet Cert projects have got great stuff. And then social media is connecting people more and more. And I've seen amazing stuff being shared on there as well. So if we understand the value of these things, we'll make more informed decisions.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, I've narrowed things down now. I'm afraid I've done a lot of culling on the questions. I have got 7 questions left that I want to ask. Don't put any more questions. They would have to be the best question of your life to be asked at this stage.
Woohoo!
We've got Jim for another minute. I tricked him into an extra 10 minutes, I think, or maybe he just agreed to it, but we've done that. We've got a little bit of time. 7 questions. Let's go. Bang. Craig Ruddock. Craig Ruddock in Richmond. I know why you're asking this, Craig. Craig asks, do parakeets pose a threat to bats?
Yeah, absolutely. We've talked about grey squirrels. They are competing for our cavity dwelling species, not just bats. They will have an impact on birds, small mammals, and bats. Parakeets, unfortunately, are just the next wave of it. I'm lucky enough not to have them where I live, but I think it's going to be on the horizon that inevitably they will have an impact on bats.
Thank you, Jim. Emma asks, and this is a great question for you arbs out there, I think. What species of trees are the best to plant for bats in the future?
So I think we need to consider 2 things. One of them is thinking about where their food comes from, and the other one is thinking about where they roost. And so I think the kind of classic ones for roosting, people are already familiar with. You think about ash trees, oak trees, even things like yew trees are fantastic, very well used, sweet chestnut trees, these ones that are such grand specimens. But let's not forget the ones that produce nectar and pollen as well. So our flowering species, I mentioned goat willow as that early food source. So if you can get that diversity of flowering, as far into summer as you possibly can, that's got to be useful. Sycamore is a really interesting one because wherever you get sycamore and squirrels, you get bats because the squirrels damage the tree. That creates wounds, creates cavities that the bats will end up using. So I think if you think of it in that way, make sure they've got food, make sure they've got somewhere to live, and probably different species for each of those. Yeah.
Brilliant. So diversity is the answer. Same with every other
It's
question
always the
about
answer, isn't it?
species. Diversity is the answer to so many of our problems. Mike G asks, Jim, which bats are cooler, British bats or American bats?
I have not seen any American bats in the flesh. Show me an American bat that lives in tree and we can put them on the same podium as nocturnal bat, Barbastell and Beckstein's bats. That's all I care about. As long as they live in trees, they're good to me.
Yeah, Mike. Stupid American bats. Melissa has snuck in there under the radar and has asked a question on behalf of Thomas, age 7. Welcome, Thomas. I hope you're enjoying the webinar. Jim pitches things just right, I find, for the under 10 audience. Thomas asks, do all bats have wings that extend over their legs as well as their arms?
So the membrane itself stretches essentially from these fingers here and it connects all the way up to the body. And depending on the species, it will either attach at the ankle or the toe. And then they have tail membranes between their 2 feet. So some species, as we saw earlier on, the Natterer's bat scooping the spider out of the web, they use the tail membrane for feeding. Whereas other species like the horseshoe, the perch hunter, it wants to be able to spin around and scan the environment. So it has a very reduced tail membrane. So it kind of connects all the way through, essentially. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Andrew, I'm not going to ask you a question. Andrew, you don't have to answer this, but Andrew's question is, what have I got in my pocket? And Andrew, we're not going to fall for your little game because it's not funny. It's not big. It's not clever. David Humphreys asks a very good question, which is also relevant perhaps to ours. And David's question is, are any British bat species known to eat OPM moths, oak processionary moth?
Yes. I mentioned Barbastell earlier on. Barbastell is a moth specialist and they're not fussy. They go for the moth species that's most abundant. At the European Bat Research Symposium earlier this year, there was a talk on pine processionary moth and they were looking at the bat species that fed on them. And essentially, so many bat species that feed on moth, they're just not fussy. They just go for the abundance. Whatever's most abundant, they will take that off. So if you think about if you're in an area where we have OPM, there's various factors that will control that. And one of them undoubtedly is the kind of the pressures of the urban environment and where the kind of that initial outbreak originated from. But if you also then think about how natural those environments are, do you have those predators to keep these things in check? Do you have birds? Do you have bats to take these out? And you will have some, but you probably won't have as many as in the more natural environments. And Barbastell, it's not particularly a species that's associated with urban areas, shall we say. And so those ones that feed on moths, they tend to be slower flying, a little bit more light adverse. So they're kind of being forced out of these areas as the moths are coming in. So if you're thinking about that natural predator control, there's other things that we need to consider in order to get those predators into those environments.
Thank you. Okay, we're down to our final 2 questions, and they're the 2 most important questions I think that we have got all night. Jim, I hope you saw this one an hour ago and have been preparing it, because the question is from Andrew Dixon, age 40, who says, what is your favourite bat joke?
My favourite bat joke?
Yeah, I've got one about vampires, which I think falls into the right category.
So I don't have bat jokes. I do have cheese jokes.
That's cheese bats. I think we've learned tonight that it's pretty much the same.
So I'm a big fan of cheese jokes. So what cheese is made backwards?
Edam.
Edam, of course. What cheese do you use to hide a horse
I know.
or disguise a horse?
I
Of
don't
course,
know.
it's mascarpone.
That's terrible. Well done, Christine. You got that. Points for you.
How do you coax a bear down from a tree? Come on, bear. You got to say it like that as well, otherwise it doesn't work.
This has all got weird. I can see why 400 people have left now.
What's your vampire joke?
Ah, that's a good joke. It's kind of about bats. So there's two nuns. There's two nuns driving through Transylvania. And a big bat lands on the bonnet of the car and turns into a vampire. And the young nun turns to the older nun and says, "What do we do?" And the old nun says, "Show him your cross." So the young nun goes, "Get off my bonnet, you pointy tooth git!" Yeah.
I could see Andrew Dixon was slightly worried which way it was going to go when you introduced nuns into the joke. I was also a little bit worried.
And I think Andrew was right, because I did swap some blue language for that last bit. Anyway, we're not here for that. This will all be edited out at the end. Don't worry about it. So that was the penultimate question. The final question of the evening. And I'm asking you, Jim, maybe for the third time, so we're not going to be getting the A game here, but still, I'm sure you've got something special. What is your favorite tree-related book?
Tree-related book.
Or bat-related?
Has to be, let me grab it off the shelf. Has to be the amazing Bat Roost in Trees book by the Bat Tree Habitat Key project. I talked about species recovery in the UK and how we have some success with greater horseshoe in particular. We talked about the species of bat that pollinates tequila as well. That's only made possible when we study and understand the species that we're working on. And once we understand them, then we can implement conservation measures. For too long, and unfortunately to this day, there's other guidance that essentially is just pick some random days to go and survey for bats. And the likelihood is we're not going to find bats. So as a result, we end up cutting down trees that have bats in them. This is the only thing that really attempts to use data to do that. And it's not perfect, probably will never be perfect. But someone once came up to me after a presentation and used the phrase, "Don't let perfect be the enemy of good." Let's just take one step forward. Let's use the knowledge that we have to make one step forward. And once we're there, let's make the next step forward or the next step forward. People get far too hung up to say, "Oh yeah, but it's not right, it's not perfect." So just throw it all out. So yeah, it's an interesting book. There's lots of information in there. It's perhaps a bit of a challenging read at times, but if you can get through it, if you can use it, it's fantastic. There's a few videos on my YouTube channel about using that data by playing around with the pivot table in Excel. Colleague Sean Sheriston is working on a web app that will kind of extract the data for you, so you don't have to play around with an Excel sheet. That will be launched soon. We were planning to launch it a little while ago, but we tried to do a LinkedIn Live, but it didn't. The technology escaped us. So LinkedIn Live is coming up at some point to just explain our rationale behind this approach, and Sean will introduce the tool. So yeah, well worth it.
A great choice, Jim. Thank you very much indeed. What a superstar. What a superstar you are, Jim. You're brilliant. Thank you very much. That was really wonderful. Thank you, Jim. Thank you to all of you for watching. What a great start to... Have you made that happen by doing that? Have you... What? No! You're doing something. I don't know how it works. I'm scared by this. So thank you, Jim. Thank you, everyone, for watching. You're all wonderful. I really hope that you can join us next week for Ted Green. I don't know what that looked like. It was gas, but it was balloons. I look forward to next week. I hope we're going to see you there. Thank you, Steele, for sponsoring us, of course. Thank you, Jim, for presenting. Thank you, all of you, for watching. Thank you, Andrew, for helping behind the scenes and giving up your Wednesday evening. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Happy Halloween. Good night.
Happy Halloween.